In the spring of 1940, as Europe burned under the machinery of modern war, one British officer stepped onto the battlefield carrying something that looked like it belonged in a museum. Tanks roared across France, machine guns rattled across the hedgerows, aircraft screamed overhead. Every army in the world was racing to build faster guns, heavier artillery, and more powerful engines of destruction. But Captain Jack Churchill walked into this industrial war with a 6-foot English longbow. To most of the officers around him, it seemed absurd. The British Army had spent decades preparing for modern warfare. Military academies emphasized firepower, coordination, and mechanization. War was supposed to be decided by artillery barrages and armored divisions. A medieval weapon had no place on such a battlefield. And yet, Churchill carried it anyway. To understand why, you have to go back long before World War II began, to the strange upbringing of the man soldiers would later nickname Mad Jack. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born in 1906 into a military family. His father served as a British Army officer, and like many boys raised in that world, young Jack grew up surrounded by stories of campaigns, battles, and distant frontiers of the British Empire. Discipline, courage, and adventure were not just ideals in his household, they were expectations. But Jack Churchill developed interests that set him apart from other officers of his generation. While many young men admired rifles and pistols, Churchill became fascinated by ancient weapons, especially the longbow. The English longbow had once dominated medieval battlefields. At battles like Agincourt in 1415, it had allowed English archers to devastate armored knights from hundreds of yards away. But by the 20th century, the weapon was considered little more than a historical curiosity. Churchill didn't see it that way. He practiced archery obsessively, not casually, not as a hobby, but with the discipline of a professional soldier. He studied historical techniques, trained his strength to handle the heavy draw weight, and learned to shoot with speed and accuracy. For him, the longbow was not simply a relic of the past, it was a weapon that demanded skill, patience, and nerve. Archery wasn't his only unusual passion. Churchill was also an accomplished bagpiper. The haunting sound of the pipes had once echoed across Scottish battlefields, rallying troops and terrifying enemies. By the early 20th century, bagpipes were mostly ceremonial. They appeared in parades, not firefights. Yet Churchill loved them. He would often carry his bagpipes wherever he went, practicing whenever he could. To him, the instrument wasn't just music, it was a symbol of tradition and morale. On a battlefield filled with chaos and fear, sound could carry a message stronger than any order shouted over gunfire. And then there was the sword. While most officers in the British Army carried pistols, Churchill preferred a broadsword, not a decorative officer's blade, but a real fighting sword, heavy, sharp, meant for close combat. To modern soldiers, the idea seemed ridiculous, but Churchill believed something that many military theorists overlooked. War, he argued, was not only about technology, it was about psychology. An enemy who expects machine guns and artillery knows how to react. They take cover. They follow their training. They fight according to familiar patterns. But an enemy confronted with something unexpected, something bizarre, even terrifying, can freeze. Shock breaks discipline. Confusion creates hesitation. And in combat, hesitation can be fatal. Before the war, Churchill attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, one of Britain's most prestigious officer academies. There, cadets were taught the latest doctrines of modern warfare. Mechanized armies, coordinated infantry tactics, and the growing importance of air power dominated the curriculum. But Churchill absorbed these lessons in his own way.
He understood the importance of modern weapons, he respected them, but he never believed they were the whole story. To him, courage and aggression mattered as much as firepower. If a soldier could dominate the psychological space of the battlefield, if he could make the enemy doubt, hesitate, or panic, he already had an advantage. And Churchill was not afraid of looking ridiculous if it gave him that edge. Before the war, Churchill served in various postings across the British Empire. Those who knew him described a man who thrived on challenge and adventure. He was athletic, fearless, and sometimes dangerously unconventional. He competed in archery competitions. He played bagpipes publicly, and he often carried weapons that most officers had long abandoned. When war finally arrived in 1939, Europe plunged into the most mechanized conflict the world had ever seen. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics smashed through Poland, combining tanks, aircraft, and fast-moving infantry into a terrifying new form of warfare. Traditional armies struggled to keep up. The British Expeditionary Force deployed to France to resist the German advance. Officers prepared their men for artillery barrages, armored assaults, and aerial attacks. But none of them expected what Captain Jack Churchill would bring with him. While most soldiers packed rifles, grenades, and ammunition, Churchill added 3 items to his kit: a longbow, a quiver of arrows, and a Scottish broadsword. To many of his fellow officers, it looked like a joke. Some assumed he carried them as a kind of eccentric decoration. Others believed he simply enjoyed the theatrical image. But Churchill was completely serious. He once explained his reasoning with a line that would become famous among British commandos. "In my opinion," he said, "any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." That sentence captured everything about the man. To Jack Churchill, war was not only about killing the enemy, it was about spirit, boldness, and the willingness to act when others hesitated. And very soon, on a foggy morning in France, he would prove that his strange philosophy could produce results no one expected. Because when German soldiers advanced through the mist towards British positions in May of 1940, they were preparing to face rifles and machine guns. What they did not expect was an English officer standing behind a stone wall, drawing back the string of a medieval longbow.
The morning of May 27, 1940, began like countless other mornings during the collapse of France. A thin mist clung to the countryside near the small village of L'Épinette. The fields were quiet, broken only by distant artillery and the occasional crack of rifle fire echoing through the hedgerows. For the soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force, the situation had already turned desperate. German forces had smashed through Allied lines with terrifying speed. The new doctrine of blitzkrieg, fast armored divisions supported by aircraft and motorized infantry, had shattered the traditional defensive strategies the Allies had prepared for years. Units were retreating across northern France, trying to regroup, trying to slow the German advance, trying simply to survive. In the confusion of collapsing fronts and chaotic withdrawals, small pockets of British troops were left scattered across the countryside. Captain Jack Churchill and the men under his command were among them. They had taken up positions near a stone wall along a narrow road that cut between fields and trees. It was the kind of defensive position soldiers had used for centuries. The wall offered some protection. The hedgerows limited visibility. Anyone advancing would have to move cautiously. The problem was that the Germans were advancing everywhere. Churchill studied the terrain carefully. He knew that if a German patrol came down that road, the encounter would be fast and violent. Rifles would fire, grenades would fly, and whoever reacted first would likely win. But Churchill was thinking about something else entirely.
Across his back hung a quiver filled with arrows. In his hands was the weapon many British officers had laughed at only months before, a 6-foot English longbow. To understand how strange this moment truly was, you have to remember the nature of modern warfare in 1940. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Rifles could hit targets hundreds of yards away. Artillery shells could destroy entire buildings in seconds. A bow and arrow seemed hopelessly outdated. But Churchill believed the weapon still had one advantage: silence. A rifle shot echoes across a battlefield. It reveals a position instantly. But an arrow, once released, travels almost invisibly. There is no flash, no smoke, no thunder of gunpowder, only impact. As the mist drifted slowly across the road, Churchill spotted movement in the distance. German soldiers. A small patrol of the Wehrmacht was moving cautiously through the fog. They advanced with rifles ready, scanning the fields and hedges for signs of British resistance. Like countless other patrols that morning, they were probing ahead, searching for scattered Allied units. One of the German soldiers, likely a sergeant, moved slightly ahead of the others. He had no idea he was being watched. Behind the stone wall, Churchill slowly raised his bow. The motion was calm, practiced. This was not the first time he had drawn the weapon. Years of training had made the movement instinctive. He selected an arrow from the quiver, placed it against the string, and pulled. An English longbow requires tremendous strength to draw fully. The tension of the string can exceed 100 pounds. Medieval archers trained their entire lives to handle such weapons effectively, but Churchill had prepared for this moment for years. The bow bent into a perfect curve. Through the fog, the German sergeant continued walking forward. 30 yards away, Churchill released the string. The arrow shot forward with sudden speed, slicing through the mist before anyone could react. A moment later, the German soldier collapsed. For a split second, the rest of the patrol didn't understand what had happened. There had been no gunshot, no muzzle flash, no warning. Just a man falling to the ground. Confusion spread instantly through the group. The German soldiers dropped for cover, searching desperately for the source of the attack. Rifles swung toward the hedgerows, eyes scanned the fields. But the weapon that had struck them belonged to another era entirely. Historians would later note that this moment likely represented the last confirmed battlefield kill with a longbow in modern warfare, and it happened in the middle of World War II. Churchill's men quickly followed the arrow strike with rifle fire, turning the ambush into a conventional engagement. The stunned German patrol was forced to retreat, leaving the body of their fallen sergeant behind. But the psychological effect of the attack lingered far longer than the skirmish itself. Imagine the perspective of those German soldiers. They were trained to fight an industrial war: rifles, machine guns, artillery, tanks. Their manuals described modern weapons, modern tactics, modern enemies. Now suddenly, one of their men had been killed by something that seemed to belong in a medieval battlefield. An invisible weapon launched from somewhere in the fog. For Churchill, the moment confirmed everything he believed about psychological warfare. Technology alone did not define combat. Surprise did. Fear did. Confusion did. Even his fellow British soldiers struggled to believe what had happened. Stories began spreading quickly through nearby units. An officer with a bow, a German killed with an arrow. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others treated it as proof that Churchill truly was as unconventional as rumors suggested. But the story followed him. and in a war filled with massive tank battles and strategic bombing campaigns, the image of one British officer calmly drawing a medieval longbow in the middle of a 20th century battlefield became something unforgettable. Yet that strange moment in France was only the beginning, because Churchill's reputation would grow far stranger and far more legendary in the years that followed. Soon he would join an entirely new kind of military unit, a force designed not just to fight the enemy, but to terrify them.
By the end of 1940, the war in Europe had changed dramatically. France had fallen. The British Army had barely escaped across the English Channel during the massive evacuation known as the Dunkirk evacuation. Thousands of soldiers had been rescued, but most of their equipment had been left behind on the beaches. For many in Britain, the situation felt dangerously close to disaster. Germany now controlled most of Western Europe, and the threat of invasion hung over the British Isles. The British Army needed new strategies, new tactics, and above all, soldiers who were willing to fight in unconventional ways. That was when the British government decided to create something entirely new. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a new type of unit began to form: small, aggressive groups of highly trained soldiers who could strike suddenly along enemy coasts and disappear before the Germans could respond. These units would become known as the British Commandos. Their mission was simple in theory, but dangerous in practice. Raid occupied territory, destroy infrastructure, gather intelligence, and keep constant pressure on German forces stationed across Europe. Unlike traditional infantry, commandos would rely on speed, surprise, and shock. For Captain Jack Churchill, it was the perfect environment. His reputation as an unconventional officer had already begun to spread. While some commanders might have considered his strange habits a liability, the commandos valued exactly that kind of unpredictability. They needed men who were bold enough to attempt missions that normal units would consider impossible. Churchill volunteered immediately. Training for the commandos was brutal. Soldiers were pushed to their limits physically and mentally. Long marches through rough terrain, nighttime amphibious landings, live fire exercises, and constant drills were designed to create fighters who could operate independently in small teams. Only the toughest soldiers remained. Churchill thrived in this environment. His athleticism, fearlessness, and refusal to follow conventional expectations made him stand out even among elite troops. He climbed cliffs, crossed rivers, and marched for miles carrying heavy equipment without complaint. But he also continued to bring his unusual weapons. While other commandos carried submachine guns and grenades, Churchill often appeared with 3 distinctive items: his longbow, his broadsword, and his bagpipes. At first glance, it seemed almost theatrical. But Churchill understood something that many soldiers overlooked. Special operations often depended on confusion. When an enemy suddenly encountered something completely unexpected, even well-trained troops could lose their composure. And Churchill knew how to create that moment of shock. The opportunity to test this philosophy came in December 1941 during a daring raid along the Norwegian coast. The target was the small coastal town of Vågsøy, which had been occupied by German forces since the invasion of Norway in 1940. The town served as an important location for German naval and military operations along the coastline. The plan was bold. British commandos would land suddenly from the sea, attack German positions, destroy military facilities, and withdraw before large enemy reinforcements could arrive. Speed and surprise would be essential.
In the early morning darkness, the commandos approached the Norwegian coast aboard naval vessels. Snow covered the mountains, and icy winds swept across the water. The conditions were harsh even before the battle began. As the landing craft moved toward the shore, the commandos prepared their weapons. Rifles were checked, ammunition was secured, orders were whispered quietly between soldiers. And then something strange happened. Standing near the front of the landing force, Jack Churchill raised a set of bagpipes to his mouth. A moment later, the haunting sound of the pipes echoed across the freezing water. The tune he played was an old Scottish marching song known as the March of the Cameron Men. In centuries past, Highland warriors had marched into battle behind that same sound. Now it was echoing across a 20th century battlefield. Some of the commandos later admitted they thought Churchill had completely lost his mind. Playing bagpipes during a military assault seemed the perfect way to reveal their position to the enemy. But Churchill had no intention of hiding. The sound carried across the shoreline just as the commandos rushed onto the beaches of Vågsøy. German soldiers stationed in the town were already under attack from multiple directions. Explosions shattered buildings. Gunfire erupted in the streets. British troops advanced rapidly through the town, clearing enemy positions one by one. And somewhere among them moved a tall officer carrying a sword. Churchill charged forward with his broadsword, leading his men through the chaos of the assault. To German defenders already struggling to understand the sudden attack, the sight was deeply unsettling. A British officer, in the middle of a modern firefight, advancing with a medieval weapon. It was the kind of image no military manual could prepare a soldier for. The raid itself was a success. German positions were destroyed, military supplies were captured, and valuable intelligence was gathered before the commandos withdrew back to their ships. But what many participants remembered most was the moment the bagpipes began playing. The psychological effect was impossible to measure precisely, but it was undeniable. The unexpected sound, the sudden violence of the assault, and the strange figure of Churchill charging into battle all contributed to a sense of chaos among German defenders. It was exactly the kind of shock Churchill believed in. War, he had always argued, was not just a contest of weapons, it was a contest of will. And in moments of confusion, the side that appeared fearless could dominate the battlefield. After the raid, Churchill's reputation within the commandos grew even stronger. Stories about the officer with the sword and bagpipes spread quickly through the ranks. Some called him eccentric, others called him reckless, but many commandos admired him for something even more important. He was never afraid to lead from the front. And as the war expanded across Europe, Jack Churchill would soon face an even more dangerous battlefield. One where small groups of commandos fought deep in enemy territory against the full strength of the German army. In the mountains and valleys of Italy, the legend of Mad Jack was about to grow even larger.
By 1943, the war had entered a new phase. The Allies were no longer fighting simply to survive. They were preparing to push back into Nazi-controlled Europe and begin the long process of liberation. One of the most brutal fronts in that struggle would emerge in the mountains and valleys of southern Europe during the campaign known as the Italian Campaign. Italy's geography turned the war into a slow and exhausting grind. Steep mountains, narrow valleys, and fortified hilltop villages gave defending German forces powerful natural advantages. Every ridge could become a fortress, every road could be turned into a deadly ambush point. German troops from the Wehrmacht built strong defensive lines across the country, forcing Allied soldiers to fight for every mile of ground.
For the commandos of the British commandos, the Italian front became a battlefield of raids, patrols, and sudden attacks behind enemy positions. Small units moved quietly through forests and hills, striking German outposts, destroying supply routes, and gathering intelligence. Among these commandos was Captain Jack Churchill. By this point in the war, his reputation had already spread widely. Soldiers across different Allied units had heard stories about the officer who carried a sword, played bagpipes in combat, and once killed a German soldier with a longbow. Some believed the stories were exaggerated, others assumed they were wartime myths. But the men who served with Churchill knew the truth. He really did fight that way. In Italy, the fighting was often close and chaotic. Dense terrain limited visibility. Patrols sometimes encountered each other suddenly at short range. In those moments, the outcome depended not only on firepower, but on speed and leadership. Churchill thrived in that environment. One of the most famous incidents involving him occurred during operations near the town of Molinella. Churchill and a small group of commandos were tasked with advancing toward a German-held position. Intelligence suggested the enemy force was larger than their own, and the terrain offered little cover for a direct assault. Most commanders might have chosen a cautious approach, waiting for reinforcements or artillery support. Churchill chose something different. As night fell, he gathered his men and explained a plan that sounded almost impossible. Instead of avoiding the German position, they would attack it directly with speed and aggression, relying on surprise to overwhelm the defenders before they could react properly. The commandos moved silently through the darkness, closing the distance to the German lines. At the final moment, Churchill gave the signal. The small group of commandos suddenly rushed forward, shouting and firing as they charged into the enemy position. In the confusion of the night attack, the German defenders struggled to understand how many attackers they were facing. Churchill himself reportedly led the charge at the front, his broadsword visible even in the chaos. The sudden assault created exactly the kind of psychological shock he believed in. The German soldiers, expecting a cautious approach or a larger assault force, were caught completely off guard. Within minutes, the position collapsed. Several German soldiers were killed in the firefight, and many others surrendered. According to accounts from the commandos present, Churchill personally captured a group of enemy troops during the raid. Stories like this quickly spread through Allied forces operating in Italy. Soldiers who had never met Churchill began hearing about the fearless officer who charged enemy positions with a sword and treated the battlefield almost like a medieval warrior. But there was more to his leadership than theatrics. Commandos serving under him knew that he would never ask them to take a risk he wasn't willing to take himself. When a dangerous mission began, he was usually at the front of the formation. That kind of leadership built intense loyalty among his troops. War correspondents and fellow officers began referring to him by the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Mad Jack. The name reflected both admiration and disbelief. His behavior seemed reckless, even absurd in an age dominated by automatic weapons and mechanized warfare. But the results spoke for themselves. Again and again, Churchill's aggressive style achieved success in situations where hesitation might have led to disaster. His belief in shock, speed, and psychological dominance proved effective in the chaotic environment of small commando operations. Yet war has a way of eventually catching up with even the boldest soldiers. In 1944, during operations in Yugoslavia aimed at supporting local resistance fighters against German occupation, Churchill's luck finally began to run out. His unit launched another daring attack against German positions, but this time the enemy response was overwhelming. Heavy fire erupted across the battlefield. Explosions shattered the ground around the commandos. One by one, Churchill's men were forced to withdraw under intense pressure. Despite the chaos, Churchill reportedly continued fighting until a mortar explosion knocked him unconscious. When he woke, he was no longer on the battlefield. He was a prisoner of war. German officers quickly realized that they had captured a highly unusual enemy soldier. His name, his reputation, and his strange equipment had already circulated through military reports. For the Germans, the capture of Jack Churchill was not just another prisoner taken in battle. It was the capture of a legend. But even captivity would not end his determination to resist. Because the story of Mad Jack Churchill was far from over.
When Captain Jack Churchill regained consciousness, the battlefield was gone. The noise of gunfire had faded. The shouting of soldiers had disappeared. Instead, there was only the heavy silence that follows defeat. Around him stood German troops from the Wehrmacht, their rifles pointed cautiously in his direction. The mortar explosion that had struck near him had ended the fight. His commando unit had been scattered, and Churchill had been captured. For many soldiers, capture meant the end of the war. Months or even years spent behind barbed wire, waiting for a conflict that might never end. But Churchill was not the type of man who accepted captivity quietly. The German officers who interrogated him quickly realized they had an unusual prisoner. His name had already appeared in reports. Some had heard rumors about the British officer who carried a sword into battle and played bagpipes during assaults. To them it sounded almost mythical. Churchill confirmed it calmly. But what surprised the Germans even more was his attitude. He showed no sign of fear or defeat. Instead, he remained confident, almost amused by the situation, because in his mind, the war was far from over. Churchill was transported through occupied Europe and eventually placed in a prisoner of war camp intended for high-value or politically significant captives. One of the locations where he was held was the notorious Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Conditions inside the camp were harsh and tightly controlled. Guards watched prisoners constantly. Escape attempts were rare and extremely dangerous. For most prisoners, survival became the only goal. But Churchill was already planning something else. He began carefully observing the routines of the guards, the layout of the fences, and the habits of the patrols that moved around the camp at night. Escape, he believed, was not impossible. It simply required patience and the right moment. Eventually, that moment arrived. One night, Churchill and another officer slipped away from their confinement and attempted to escape the camp. Moving through the darkness, they managed to get beyond the immediate security area and into the surrounding countryside. For a brief time, it looked like the plan might work. But the German search teams were experienced. Within days, the escapees were captured again and returned to German custody. Even so, Churchill's determination impressed both fellow prisoners and even some of the guards. Most soldiers would have accepted the reality of imprisonment. Churchill refused to stop resisting. Later in the war, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe and German defenses began collapsing, many prisoners were transferred between camps in an effort to keep them away from advancing armies. Churchill was moved again, this time to a different facility in the mountains of Austria. It was there, in the final chaotic weeks of the war in Europe, that his captivity finally ended. As German authority began to collapse across the region, Allied forces approached the area where the prisoners were being held. Eventually, Churchill and the other captives were liberated by advancing troops, bringing his long ordeal as a prisoner of war to an end. For many soldiers, the experience of captivity would have marked the conclusion of their military careers. But Jack Churchill was not finished with adventure.
After returning to British control, he actually expressed frustration that the war in Europe had ended before he could rejoin combat. According to later accounts, he reportedly complained that if it hadn't been for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, the war might have continued long enough for him to fight there as well. The war had changed the world. Massive armies, advanced aircraft, and industrial weapons had defined the conflict. Historians often describe World War II as the most mechanized war in history. Yet somehow, in the middle of that modern battlefield, one officer carried weapons that seemed to belong to another age: a longbow, a broadsword, and a set of bagpipes. For some observers, Churchill's actions appeared eccentric, even reckless, but for the men who served beside him, those choices symbolized something deeper: courage, confidence, and the power of psychological shock in combat. Churchill had always believed that war was not decided only by machines or numbers. It was decided by human beings, their morale, their fear, and their willingness to act when others hesitated. By introducing the unexpected into battle, he forced enemies to confront something they could not easily understand. And sometimes that moment of confusion was enough to change the outcome of a fight. After the war, Churchill continued serving in the British Army for several more years before eventually retiring. He lived a long life filled with travel, adventure, and the same unconventional spirit that had defined his wartime career. But the legend that followed him would never fade. Historians still remember him as one of the most unusual soldiers of the entire conflict, not because he commanded massive armies or planned famous campaigns, but because he proved that even in the most modern war ever fought, a warrior from another age could still leave his mark. The story of Jack Churchill reminds us that technology may shape the battlefield, but human imagination and courage still shape the outcome. And sometimes, the most unexpected weapon of all is the willingness to fight in a way no one else dares to try.